This is the second video lecture over the Apology of Socrates by Plato. The last lecture left off with Socrates having devised a method for interpreting the oracle's prophecy. I realized, he says, that if I could only find a man who was wiser, then I might go to the god with a refutation in my hand and say, look, here is a man who is wiser than I am. So what is the meaning in your saying I am the wisest? All right, so let's look at the details of this sort of philosophical mission that Socrates formulates for himself. He examines three classes of citizens, and each class represented three sites of social authority in Athens. There were the politicians, representing political and legal authority. There were the poets that he examined, representing religious and educational authority. And then there were the craftsmen. This was the sort of common man representing the authority of common sense in ancient Athenian society. And at the end of what Socrates describes as his Herculean labors, at the end of his mission, he believes that he has finally discovered the meaning of the oracle's prophecy. So what's the meaning of the oracle saying that Socrates was the wisest man living, the wisest man in all of Greece? It means that human wisdom is worth very little or nothing at all, and that the god only is wise. As Socrates puts it, and so when the oracle says that Socrates is wise, she is simply using my name as an example, as if the god were saying, the wisest man among you mortals is the man who, like Socrates, understands that his wisdom is worthless. And so in order to explain his own wisdom, Socrates argues for a distinction between merely human wisdom and a sort of superhuman or absolute wisdom. Human wisdom is the awareness of one's own ignorance, and absolute or superhuman wisdom is actually possessing knowledge of the true nature of things. And so Socrates denies that he has any sort of absolute wisdom, though he certainly has this first form of human wisdom. And so the idea here is that the first philosophical awakening that we're capable of having, which is exemplified by Socrates, is this profound recognition that becoming aware of one's own ignorance is the very condition for the possibility of attaining any wisdom or knowledge at all. And so the significance of this existential self-awareness is captured in the famous Greek proverb, which was inscribed in front of the oracle's temple at Delphi. Nothai seoton, right? In Greek, know thyself. And so Socrates' interpretation of the god's prophecy doesn't stop here, however. He tells the jury that the god actually attached him to the city. In other words, that the god had given Socrates a mission: philosophize to the city and wake up your fellow Athenians from their slumbering, thoughtless, automated existences. And so that's what Socrates sets out to do for the next 30 years of his life. Now, moving on throughout the rest of his defense, Socrates actually provides two different defenses as he identifies two different sets of accusers, right? There's the earlier accusers, and then there's the later or the current accusers. Now, the later accusers, they're the ones who are now bringing the indictment against Socrates in court: Meletus, Anytus, and Lycon. They've been prejudiced against Socrates for years, and they accuse him on behalf of those three classes of citizens that Socrates publicly humiliated: Meletus on behalf of the poets, Anytus on behalf of the craftsmen, and Lycon on behalf of the politicians. And then there are the earlier accusers. And so what we know about them is that Socrates says they are many in number and they are far more dangerous than his current accusers. The reason they're more dangerous is because they have been mass slandering Socrates for decades and decades. So they've sort of poisoned the city against him. But the accusations of the earlier accusers, who were many and slanderous, their accusations were simply accepted by default by those who heard them, as Socrates was not present to actually defend himself. And their accusations, he says, took possession of people's minds, when they were young and impressionable. Now, Socrates thinks that it's actually very unlikely that he's going to be found innocent because the prejudices against him are so ingrained in the minds of the jury. And so it's kind of helpful to imagine whether or not there are contemporary examples of this sort of phenomenon. In other words, whether there are people or historical figures that we have perhaps been poisoned against without actually knowing very much about them at all. I think one example of this is often the philosopher Karl Marx, right? Many people who despise Marxism have never actually read anything by Marx or could even identify his country of origin. Another sort of philosopher who I think falls into a similar category is Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche is despised by many non-philosophers and Christians for claiming that, quote, God is dead. But again, very few people know what Nietzsche actually meant by this because they've never actually taken the time to read the philosopher. We might think of someone like the Prophet Muhammad as someone who many folks have never read about, never having opened the Quran or anything else, but nonetheless have certainly a prejudice against. Now, Socrates says that these earlier accusers had nothing of actual substance to accuse him of. So what they did was they made use of the sort of prefabricated stock lies and slanders that are often used to discredit philosophers. And so Socrates sums up these slanderous accusations and then presents them to the jury as a new indictment, right? The early accusations here in the form of a new indictment. And then it's that Socrates is an evildoer, a dangerously curious person who searches into things under the earth and in the heavens, who makes the worst argument appear the stronger, and who teaches the others to do the same. And so let's consider the first accusation, that Socrates, quote, searches into things under the earth and in the heavens. Now, this was an accusation that Socrates practiced natural philosophy, or a philosophy of nature. And this refers to the philosophical study of the natural world that was sort of dominant before the development of modern science. And so the natural philosophers of ancient Greece, what they did was they provided non-religious, that is, non-myth-based explanations for things like the nature and existence of the heavenly bodies, right? The sun, the moon, the stars, the etc. They provided non-myth-based explanations for phenomenon like eclipses and famines, floods, meteor showers, lightning storms, etc. And they also provided explanations for the basic elements or stuff that made up reality. Now, Socrates simply denies that he has ever practiced natural philosophy, arguing that no one has ever heard him suggest that the moon and the sun were anything but gods. Meletus must have me confused with Anaxagoras, Socrates says. Anaxagoras was a famous Greek natural philosopher who argued, among many other things, that the sun was actually a great fiery mass, right, and not a god, Apollo. All right, so let's look at the second and third accusations, right, that Socrates makes the worse argument the stronger and teaches others to do the same. The substance of this accusation is that Socrates uses argumentation and rhetoric, not in the service of truth, but rather for personal gain. In other words, they were accusing Socrates of practicing sophistry. The practice of sophistry originally meant the teaching of rhetoric, but over time, the designation of sophistry came to take on a negative connotation in Greece. And this is because many of the sophists, they would instruct their students in using rhetoric and tricks of wordplay to manipulate an audience, to serve their own interests. And so these earlier accusers are arguing that Socrates was one of these sophists, right? That he was not a speaker of truth or a genuine improver or educator. And so we really have to think a little bit more about sophists and the practice of sophistry. The sophists were sort of like opportunistic self-help gurus of the ancient world. And they were seen by many as these nomadic hucksters traveling from city to city selling their particular product. And their selling pitch was, hire me and I'll teach your young men to excel in politics, to become wealthy, to achieve standing in the city. They were sort of like the ancient Greek version of how to win friends and influence people. Now, of course, the idea that Socrates was one of these hucksters was painfully offensive to him, as though he were going around selling a sort of spiritual snake oil, as though human greatness and virtue had anything to do with achieving fame or worldly success. Now, the principles of sophistic education consisted of rhetoric, which was the art of constructing persuasive arguments. The principles of sophistic education also consisted of moral skepticism, right? The idea that moral truth is not objective or universal, but relative to culture. And epistemological relativism, right? The idea that the truth is whatever can be argued persuasively. Now, the sophists were widely unpopular in Athens, and it's because they had actually triggered something of a cultural crisis in the city, and it was a crisis having to do with education. See, for generation after generation, the accepted traditions in Athens were the primary teachers in the society, along with one's parents. Yet the profession of sophistry attacked this site of authority, right? Because sophistry had undermined the tradition of parental education and challenged the authority of the accepted customs and traditions. The important Greek concept here is that of nomos. All right, it meant law, but also custom, convention, tradition. Right? The nomos of the culture wasn't merely the laws that had been established, right, by the state, but the nomos was simply the accepted ways of doing things. Nomos was the teacher in Athens. Nomos, right, tradition is what reigned as king. And so the sophists who visited Athens, they challenged the established Athenian nomos. And they did this by arguing quite convincingly that a person's belief that the Athenian institutions and values were the good ones and the true ones was simply a byproduct of their having been indoctrinated by the Athenian nomos and the Athenian forms of life. Right? Had you been raised elsewhere, the sophists argued, you would call true many of the beliefs that you now declare false, yet you would believe them just as fiercely. Now, Socrates denies outright that he was a sophist. I've never accepted money to teach anything, right? He declares again and again. But even though Socrates never taught for money, in the mind of many Athenians, he was just as culturally subversive as the sophists were. And this is because Socrates and all of the philosophers, they also challenged the unquestioned authority of nomos and tradition and custom, and even to some extent law. All right, so before we move on to the later accusations and the later accusers, we should really kind of pause here, because the sophistical, that is the sophists' attack and the philosophers' attack on the authority of nomos is absolutely essential when it comes to understanding Socrates' philosophical mission in Athens and why exactly he was lumped in with these professional teachers of rhetoric. So we can review the following chart to help us grasp the importance of the concept of nomos, that is tradition, custom, and the philosophers and the sophists' challenge to nomos. So again, nomos, right, it was the concept of law as well as the individual laws. Nomos was the custom, the conventions, the traditions. Nomos is what formed the fixed mental tendencies and predispositions of the Athenians. It was the traditions and the belief in the goodness of the traditions that was passed on from one generation to the next. It was considered the most important teacher of the youth, along with one's parents. And nomos is what generated the accepted social authority. It was the traditions, it was nomos that was consulted if one was asked, why should Athens have these institutions and not others? Right? The response would simply be, well, it's because Athens is the greatest city, and these are the traditions that we've always had. Right? Nomos formed or generated the ready-made views and the ready-made beliefs that were taken up in religion and in politics and in ethics. And nomos was considered natural and absolute. But nonetheless, the nomos, right, the cultural norms, they varied dramatically from one place to the next. And the sophists like to point this out. Nonetheless, right, the Athenians, they took their customs and their traditions for being natural and absolute and universal. Now, then we can look at both the sophists and the philosophers' relationship to the traditions, right, to the nomos. The sophists were paid teachers, right? They were the new profession in Athens. They taught rhetoric, argumentation. They catered to the wealthy, ambitious youth. But the philosophers, right, they didn't take money to teach, though they did have students. They had followers. The sophists tended to be nomadic, right? That's why they saw how wildly the nomos varied from one particular culture to the next. The philosophers were not nomadic, right? They tended to live and dwell and teach in the city in which they were born. The sophists were ethical or moral skeptics. In other words, they didn't recognize any absolute truth in ethical matters. But the philosophers did not tend to be ethical skeptics, right? They may not have known what objective moral truth was, but they searched for it, right? They believed that it existed. Similarly, the sophists were epistemological relativists, right? Again, that knowledge is simply relative to the person arguing, and whatever they can argue successfully is simply true. There's no objective truth in any matter, not just ethical matters. The philosophers, again, did not tend to be relativists. They, again, searched for truth regarding political matters and ethical matters. But where the two were similar is that both the sophists and the philosophers attacked the absolute authority of nomos in religious matters, in political matters, and ethical matters, right? The philosophers and the sophists denied that one could simply appeal to the existing traditions in order to articulate an explanation as to why Athens should have these religious traditions, these political traditions, and these social traditions, and not other ones. And because of this, both the sophists and the philosophers had a bad reputation. They were perceived as having a corrupting influence on the youth. They were seen as representing a profound challenge to sites of traditional authority, especially parental authority, when it comes to the ability of one generation to transmit dominant values to the next. All right, so this is it for lecture 2. For the next lecture, we'll continue this discussion of nomos and then Socrates' defense speech, looking in particular at some of his metaphors, right, regarding him being a gadfly and the city being a noble steed. We'll think about his arguments concerning civil disobedience and obedience to the state and whether it's just to refuse to obey the state, and we'll look at his arguments around death and a few other themes.